This is Ethan, CFA charter holder and investment professional. And at the request of Matt in our Discord, today I'll be reviewing the top defense ETFs: ITA, XAR, PPA, SHLD, GCAD, and DFEN. But more importantly, I'll also be showing you how you can do this kind of research yourself to figure out the best way to capitalize on investment opportunities that you see using only free tools out there in the internet. Let's dive in. I didn't ask Matt why he thinks the defense industry is a good investment opportunity, but here are two reasons I think it might be attractive. One, if you think the world has been getting more peaceful, please leave a comment with what makes you believe that. My observation, along with, I'm sure, many other people's, has been the opposite. War in the Middle East, war in Europe, multiple wars in Africa, and heightened tensions between the US and China, all with the potential to increase defense spending if they escalate. Two, the defense industry refers to weapons like defending your country, but it also happens to be defensive in the sense that these companies generally do well in market downturns and recessions. Think about it. If people are losing their jobs and tightening their budgets, they'll probably spend less on restaurants, clothes, travel, luxury goods, many other things, right? But countries are not going to stop defending themselves. So defense companies are usually defensive in stock market downturns, aka they usually do better than the overall market. Once you've identified something as an opportunity, which you can learn how to do in this video, the next step is to literally Google something like defense industry ETFs or oil ETFs or whatever you're interested in investing in. This video that you're watching now will show you what to do next. For something common and standardized like the S&P 500, lots of options will be exactly the same, except for maybe a 2 basis point difference in expenses. If that's the case, go with the cheaper one. But for most things, there will be bigger differences that will make one ETF better for you than another. I'll start by comparing all the passive options that seem most similar and narrowing down to just one. On the surface, these all sound the same, right? And the first thing you'll notice is that none of them focus only on the defense industry. Often you will be able to find something concentrated just on what you're looking for, but in this case, it's most common to see aerospace, companies like Boeing and Airbus, mixed in with defense. Of course, Boeing and Airbus do have defense as parts of their business, it's just that the commercial side is much bigger. So let's see if these really are the same. When we go to each ETF's webpage, we can see that ITA is based on the Dow Jones US Select Aerospace and Defense Index, XAR is based on the S&P Aerospace and Defense Select Industry Index, and PPA is based on the SPADE Defense Index. That means they're not the same, and we can't just eliminate any of them solely based on the expense ratio. That will still be an important consideration, but we have to dive in to look at their differences first to see if any of those matter to us more than the cost difference. We could just Google any of these indexes, and I have certainly done that many times, but I won't put you through that torture here. The first, simplest step to see if these ETFs are different enough for us to care is to look at the fund overlap tool on the ETF Research Center website. When you plug in ITA and XAR, you can see that they're only 61% the same, which is extremely low for two things that supposedly track the same industry. If we look at ITA and PPA, it's only 65%, and if we look at PPA and XAR, it's only 56%. For the record, if we were to compare SPY and ACWI, a US ETF that tracks an S&P index, and a global ETF that tracks an MSCI index, we'd get 62% overlap. So the moral of the story here is that the differences in holdings between these aerospace and defense ETFs will make way more difference than the expense ratios. For our next step, I'm going to take you to the comparison tool on ETF.com. There are a few of these out there, and all of them have their pluses and minuses, but today we'll use this one. It only lets you compare two ETFs at a time, so I'll just do two separate comparisons and put the relevant information on the screen here to make it simple. The first thing I want to look for is, are any of them global? And effectively no, including GCAD, which is an actively managed strategy that we'll look at later. I looked pretty hard to find one that was global, but I couldn't. So if anyone watching knows of one, let me know in the comments. It's a moot point in this case, but I would want it to be global if possible, since a lot of European defense spending goes to companies like Rheinmetall, which is based in Germany, and a lot of the best aerospace companies are in Europe. But that's not a differentiating factor for these ones, so let's move on. The top 10 holdings is where it gets a little more interesting. On the left, you can see that ITA is way more concentrated than the others, with almost 50% of its assets in 3 companies. And one, GE, is not really a defense company. That's the number one fact that would probably either make you choose ITA or eliminate it. And I was about to narrow it down to a comparison of XAR and PPA, but I just learned that there's a limit on how many free comparisons you can do on ETF.com. Maybe I'm biased because in reality, I have access to tools that cost about $50,000 a year combined, but in my opinion, this tool is absolutely not worth even $15 a month. There is no information on here that isn't easy to find elsewhere, and these tools are a dime a dozen. All of them suck. All right, here's PPA versus XAR from etfdb.com. They show you all the holdings instead of just the top 10. That's a positive. Now, on the holdings side, you could spend a lot of time agonizing over these details if you wanted, but here's how I would do it to save time. My initial observation is that on the left, in PPA, there seems to be more companies like defense contractors that don't actually manufacture things, but focus specifically on the defense industry. There's also more exposure to companies like Lockheed Martin, RTX, aka Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman, which are the big US defense contractors that I think of first. They're all in XAR too, but just not as big, and the top holding, GE, isn't really mainly focused on defense. If you don't know these companies as well as I do and didn't want to look through the whole list of holdings, which I also don't, you could go look up the definitions of the indexes they track. XAR tracks the S&P 500 Aerospace and Defense Select Industry Index, which from a quick Google search to get to their website, we can see just tells us it buys stocks in the GICS aerospace and defense industry. Okay, that doesn't really tell us anything. So then we have to take one more step and look up what is the sub-industry on the GICS website. There are two things that stand out to me here. One, it's only manufacturing companies, which is one of my initial observations of the differences. PPA seemed to have more of the defense contractors or consultant type holdings, and XAR didn't, although I didn't want to waste time looking through all the holdings to find out for sure. This way was faster. The second thing I notice here is that it's manufacturers of civil or military equipment. That means that it will include companies that have nothing to do at all with defense. That's not necessarily a bad thing, it just depends on whether that's what you're looking for or not. Now, if we compare that to the SPADE Defense Index, which PPA tracks, we can see that it includes firms systemically important to defense and national or homeland security. Aha, there we go. That's why it has the military contractors and consultants on there, and that also means it will not include companies that only make aircraft or parts for civil, not military use. So, of these three, if I wanted to invest in companies that would benefit from rising defense spending, PPA would be my top choice. Notice how I did not even look at past results. Why? Because I can't invest in past results, and these are not all trying to do the same thing. If these were all trying to do the same thing, then past results would for sure be something you'd look at. But if your insight is that defense spending will go up in the future, so you want to invest in defense companies, then who really cares whether defense contractors or the makers of seats and cup holders for Southwest Airlines did better over the last 5 years? It's irrelevant. So far, PPA is the winner for pure defense ETFs. But let's see what else is out there. I don't know the incentive structures of these ETF list creators, but just know it's always good to look at more than one since they often have different ETFs on them. Next, let's compare PPA to another one that sounds interesting, SHLD, the Global X Defense Tech ETF. This one invests in companies positioned to benefit from increased adoption of defense technology like cybersecurity, advanced military systems, and other technological advancements that can be used by the defense industry. The first few things I'd noticed from the ETFdatabase.com comparison would be that SHLD's expenses are slightly lower, but not enough to make a difference for me unless the ETFs were doing pretty much the same thing. SHLD is pretty new. That would be a negative if it were actively managed or taking some complicated strategy that may or may not work in different market environments, but in this case, I don't think it makes much of a difference. SHLD is also much smaller in terms of assets. For some people, that might be a negative, but I think if you're not trying to move around millions of dollars in this position, it shouldn't make much of a difference for you. For a very quick comparison to see if we need to do any more work, let's look at the overlap tool to see if they're basically the same, and we can decide just based on expenses. Nope. Okay, let's see how they're different. My first observations when I look at their holdings are that the two top positions are the same. But then, in PPA, I see more companies like GE Aerospace, Boeing, and TransDigm that do have defense businesses, but are mainly focused on regular passenger travel. On the right, in SHLD, you have companies like BAE Systems and Rheinmetall, which are two of the biggest European defense contractors. If you think European defense spending is likely to go up, you probably want exposure to those companies. And when you compare their regional breakdowns, you can see SHLD is truly global, whereas PPA is not. Obviously, you could do a lot more research here, but for the purposes of this video, I think most people would probably be decided at this point. You probably either really want exposure to the likely beneficiaries of rising European defense spending, or you think all non-US companies suck and you only want to invest in the US. Hashtag America. Or maybe you want broader aerospace exposure and you prefer one of the first options we talked about. None of those approaches are inherently right or wrong, but it's up to you. What are you actually looking for? But before you decide, there are two more options for us to cover. The next one is GCAD, the Gabelli Commercial Aerospace and Defense ETF, which differs from the others in that it's actively managed. The main things I want to see when I'm considering an active strategy are, do they have a consistent, repeatable process that has led to strong past results with the same management team in place? For this case, where we're trying to capitalize on a specific opportunity, the focus of the fund will be just as important as it was on the other ones, but the active management adds an additional element to it. So let's see if we can glean anything useful from their website. Okay, on the left, we can see it's based in the Gabelli Private Market Value with Catalyst Research Methodology. That sounds fancy, but I have no idea what it is. When I see that, my brain says, oh boy, this could be a while. I'll dive into things like that to get a good understanding of them if I have to, but if I can eliminate a fund from consideration in other, faster ways, I prefer to do that. Next, it says there's experienced portfolio management. Well, that's good. Oh, wait, but experience doing what? Flying planes? Well, that sounds cool, but let me think about that for a second. I'm an investment professional, and I don't know the first thing about flying planes. Never came up in my training. So it stands to reason that learning how to fly planes also doesn't teach you anything about investing. And I should know because I actually once taught a college course on investing at a flight school. And then on the right, you've got puns. Personally, those are the way to my heart, but not necessarily to my wallet. So how is this strategy actually done? Well, first of all, its track record only goes back to January 2023, which would pretty much eliminate it from consideration for me on its own. Second, its results have been in between ITA and XAR and well below PPA, which, as we established, takes a bit of a different approach, so it's not perfectly comparable. So is it worth paying? Oh wait, I can't even find its expense ratio on its website or on Morningstar. And it has about $6.3 million of assets, which means they're losing money managing this ETF. And if they don't gain about 10 times as many assets as they have now, they'll probably have to shut it down. I'm sure I could find their expense ratio in their prospectus, where they legally have to include it, but at this point, there are so many red flags, it's not worth the 30 seconds of my time it would take to do that. And for the last one, the only of these ETFs I've ever actually personally invested in, let's quickly take a look at DFEN, the Direction 3 times Daily Leveraged Aerospace and Defense ETF. This one tracks the same index as ITA, but attempts to mimic 3 times its daily moves up or down. If you've been subscribed to this channel for a while, you know I love me some leveraged ETFs, although I will admit they're definitely not for everyone. If you're not yet subscribed to this channel, now would be a good time to hit that subscribe button. Need some extra motivation? These are my transaction dates on the upper left. You can see I bought this initially in early 2021, right after they announced a vaccine, which led me to the conclusion that aerospace stocks would recover after having collapsed since no one was traveling. The aerospace stocks ended up taking a little longer than I thought due to ongoing supply chain issues, which were exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, but that never really changed my long-term thesis that the industry would recover, so I continually added on weakness near the bottom over time. Timing wasn't bad, by the way, as you can see. Then, when it rallied over 75% in a couple months, I was feeling like the thesis had pretty much played out, plus I thought it had been bid up a little extra than what I was expecting because of what was happening in Israel, so I decided to exit at a substantial profit. Right after I sold, it fell about 20%, but then it did resume its climb and I've missed some gains. So obviously no one here is claiming to be an oracle, but overall, I'm pretty happy with a 57+% return. DFEN is not as directly exposed to only defense companies as some of the other options, but the leverage gives it some significant power, which, as you know, can be a good or bad thing depending on your timing. I personally am a deep value investor, so I don't really buy things that have already gone up a lot, where I feel like the positive outcome might already be priced in. But That's basically called growth investing, and a lot of people have been very successful with it, so I wouldn't necessarily discourage others from investing in defense right now. If defense spending is more than what's currently priced in, as in if military tensions escalate, these could be good investments from here. All of the options other than defense might also do well in a recession, and the ones with more broad commercial aerospace exposure could also benefit from Boeing and others getting their personnel and supply chain issues figured out. If you found this video helpful, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and join our free Discord through the link in the description, which is what Matt did and why we made this video for him. We'll look forward to seeing you in the next one.